Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing out there? Good, good. I will say that it is an honor and a privilege to be with you all here this afternoon. I'm the Reverend Dr. Anthony Bateza. I'm an associate professor of religion at St. Olaf College. And I will say, thank you. Umyaya, some olis. Nice, nice. I will say when I accepted the invitation, I hadn't realized I was right after lunch. As a professor, I think my experience has been that after lunch class session, not always the best returns, but I have high hopes for myself and yourself and the power of the Spirit and the power of caffeine. May all of the above move us accordingly. So I was invited here today to offer a theological reflection concerning the theme of this year's assembly, Embody the Word. I'm going to offer some of my own views, a little bit of Martin Luther, a little Bible study, all kind of rolled into one. And I've chosen as my topic, as you see here, embodying trust as Lutherans today. Now, it will come as no surprise to those of us paying any attention to the world that based on the headlines, there's a bit of a lack of trust in our communities. People have a lack of trust in government, in media, in each other, and of course, also in the church. Now, whether this lack of trust is a new thing or a recurring phenomena that emerges again and again, that question is up for debate. What I want us to think about in my brief time this afternoon is our own scriptural and theological language and heritage for what it means to be people who embody trust. And more specifically, how does Luther help us to understand the word and what it means to embody trust? So let's get started. As you know, us Lutherans love to celebrate anniversaries, right? 25 years since this, 500 years since that. And it just so happens that it's been 500 years since Luther's German translation of the New Testament. You might recall, quick history lesson, Luther had gotten himself into a little bit of trouble, a smidge, with the political and theological authorities of his day. And so he was being kept safe, locked away at the Wartburg Castle, working on a fantastic beard, and living a life of isolation, away from family and friends and colleagues. Now, personal aside, don't compare yourself to Luther too much. When Luther was in isolation at the Wartburg, he translated the New Testament into the German vernacular. During my isolation of COVID, my Netflix queue was decimated. So a lot of content was consumed. But Luther, unlike me, wasn't just looking to fill the hours or pass away the time. No, Luther wanted to produce a German translation, a new German translation that captured the weight and the beauty of the language in a way that moved people's hearts. And of course, Luther was responding to a number of challenges in his life and in his time. Luther felt compelled because of the world around him, the way that so many Christians understood or misunderstood their relationship with God, and because of that, their relationship with one another. And so I'm going to lay out what I think are three big challenges that Luther was addressing in his Reformation work and his work to give the people the Bible in their language. Now, challenge number one, I think, is familiar to all of us with some familiarity with the Lutheran tradition. It's a challenge that occurs again and again in Luther's thought and Luther's life. And this challenge is a deep fear of God. As you know, in Luther's time, he felt that God appeared quite judgmental. The God that was portrayed to him, that he experienced, was always pointing the finger, always having high expectations, impossible expectations, and demanding perfection or else. This is a God who's always looking for imperfections in our conducts or motives, taking note of every desire, every stray thought, and counting it against us in the ledger book of our eternal lives. Purchasing indulgences was certainly a problem, but it was a small problem, a symptom of this larger condition, where the God people were given was a God who only cared to keep track of every single mark and every single mistake. Luther had trouble reconciling this image of a judgmental God to the God that he found in Christ and the God that he saw in the Hebrew Bible. The God that had come to Abraham and Hagar and Sarah and so many didn't seem quite so invested in keeping track of every single misdeed. At the same time, though, God wasn't just judgmental. As Luther saw it, God was portrayed as kind of lazy, which seems odd. As Luther understood it, in his time, people were being taught that God is just kind of sitting back, waiting for humans to respond in some perfect or imperfect way, but to do something that will earn God's favor and curry some reward. And this seemed strange to Luther as well. Does God just sit in the very back of the sanctuary, waiting for something exciting to happen before looking up and paying attention? I mean, I do that. But hopefully God doesn't do that. God is always active, moving about, showing up in all kinds of places where one least expects it. So humans, lazy. Netflix, check. God, hopefully, not so much. The solution that so many of Luther's contemporaries had given was simply to do the best you could. God would lower expectations. Just make an honest effort and God will count that. That will allay your fears. But Luther didn't think this was as gracious as one might hope. To him, this was just another burden, another expectation, faced with a fearful God sitting off in the distance. And so Luther, in response to this situation and these challenges, looks to the Bible and the story of God's ongoing relationship with the world. He translates the Bible into German, not just because he had free time or he loved his own translation abilities, but because it was here in this book, in these stories, in these songs, in these laws, in these poems, that Luther saw God, neither fearful nor slacking. Now, as you heard Bishop Eaton say, in July we had the chance to hear 4 wonderful Bible studies from excellent scholars and teachers in our church. And I encourage you to go back and review those and check them out. I'm going to offer my own slight take that I hope complements some of their excellent work, and it's all still archived. So if you were busy in July, if you were traveling, go to the internet. Everything you've ever done is stored there somewhere. So what happens in our assembly text of Luke 24? Well, Jesus appears to the disciples after his resurrection. Mary Magdalene and the others have been dazzled and amazed by angels and shining clothing. They've told Peter, even the folks walking down the road to Emmaus had a chance to talk with Jesus. Now, everybody's holed up together, puzzling, wondering what happens next. And then, of course, Jesus appears, just pops up into the room. And the people respond as you might expect. Freaking terrified. Right? I'm always amused by how not surprising their reaction of terror is. Like, imagine your dear beloved Nana, right, suddenly shows up at Thanksgiving dinner, when she's been dead for 30 years? You're not calm. You're losing your mind. You might have loved her to the end of the world and back, but this is a terrifying experience. And part of the reason it's terrifying for Jesus' disciples is because, as you know and as I know, spirits don't come back. Right? You're supposed to go. That away. What are you doing back here? And part of the tricky idea here is that if a spirit comes back, something bad has probably happened. That spirit wasn't accepted to God's table. So this is a sign that Jesus did something wrong. Or Jesus has escaped from Sheol, where he's supposed to be living and belonging. That's what demons do. Right? Jesus now suddenly appears to be the kind of spirit that he had been casting out. Jesus appears to be terrifying. And so they are filled with terror. And so we come to see all so often in our lives that our first reaction to God's presence is often one of terror and fear. The disciples don't trust Jesus because they think Jesus is different than Jesus is. They think that Jesus is one to be afraid of, that Jesus is an escaped spirit, a dangerous soul. And so, like them, are we so often afraid of this God and not trusting this God? And this is why, at the end of the day, Luther so often insisted that faith is at the key of everything. It is unbelief, he says, that is the root and the sap and the chief power of all sin. Going back all the way to the garden, all the way to our ancient parents, Adam and Eve, there is an experience of fear and distrust. God is saying things that God doesn't mean. God is withholding. If God shows up, we better hide ourselves behind some bushes. So time and time again, we see that a lack of trust in God, as Luther would like to put it, is a serious heart condition. In our innermost selves, we are turned away from God, seeing darkness where we should see light. And so instead, in the darkness, we stare at our own navels, hoping for whatever peace and security we can find trapped therein. In this encounter, we see, and in our own lives, we see that we cannot trust God. We can't trust anybody, really, when we are afraid. Fear paralyzes. It holds our hearts captive. Where there is fear, there is not room for trust. A second challenge that Luther was wrestling with, of course, was that the church itself had become untrustworthy in his time and in his day. Like many of us, when we launch a new program, when Luther launched his German translation, he thought folks were going to be excited, right? I got some grant money, had some time away to do some writing. I've come back with this great new idea. This translation's pretty good, if I say so myself. And he passed it around, and people responded as they often did. People weren't all that receptive to what he was doing. And part of the problem, Luther thought, was that he had uncovered a serious debate about who exactly is in charge of interpreting the Bible and who is in charge of controlling the Spirit. One of the big issues Luther faced, and this is not anti-Catholic polemic, this is just Luther's own experience, was that people in his time in the papacy and the curia, the folks surrounding those in charge of bishops and priests, were convinced that they had control of the Spirit. If there's debates about what the Spirit is saying, about how to interpret the Bible, what proper theology and practice look like, we have an answer by going to particular people in the roles they have and the offices they possess. In contrast, in his appeal to the Christian leaders of the German nation, Luther laid out an attack on what he believed were the walls that people had built around God's word and God's people. Barriers that protected power and privilege at the expense of so many for the privilege of so few. Luther was more and more puzzled. If there are all these problems in the church, where are the leaders? Where are the teachers of God's people? He was looking into his days to priests and to bishops, to clergy of various kinds, perhaps in our day to rostered leaders and leaders of every stripe. Well, as Luther looked around for pious, like-minded individuals, more often than not, he found this. People who were more committed to their own bellies and their own pocketbooks, more worried about their paychecks, their budgets, their own livelihood than the livelihood of Christ's people. And so, from Luther's experience, I believe we learn the lesson that we must teach and act in ways that foster trust if we are to be the kind of church that God calls us to be. And so that leads me to the third challenge. How do we do that? How do we come to be people that can be trusting? And how do we come to trust? Well, if our fear and our lack of trust is a heart condition, is a problem of the heart, we know oh so well that you can't simply order your heart around. You can't just tell yourself to trust, to tell yourself to not be afraid. It doesn't work that way. As Luther saw it, and as we see it in Luke 24, Jesus doesn't march into the room and say, "Trust me, don't be afraid." He does say that, but he doesn't only say that. He says, "Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself. Touch and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones." Jesus says, don't be afraid, but he offers himself and his own very embodied self to help allay their fears, exposing his flesh, his wounds, his weakness, his vulnerability, and because he does so, showing his strength. I will tell you a quick personal story. A few weeks ago, actually early spring, I was engaged in a very dangerous activity. I was hanging out with a bunch of Lutheran pastors. Very risky. You all don't know the danger you're in this very room. And hanging out with these pastors, I was doing some continuing education up in the Colorado Rocky Mountains, doing some skiing as well. And I had a bit of a fall, some of my fellow skiers out there. And very small fall, I thought, but I tore my ACL, which apparently is important. Who knew? And my doctor explained to me, he's like, "Well, you're in your 40s now." And also news to me, my body's not as strong as it used to be. Man, I had a surgery, and it's taken a little while to heal. My knee's still a little stiff in places. And in this process, I've learned that it is quite frightening to discover that you can't trust your own body anymore. The things you expected and thought it could do, it's not doing. You're trying to stand and move in ways you've been privileged to do your entire life, and it's not happening. And so I've needed dedicated healthcare professionals, my family and friends, to help me trust my own body again. To get me to make movements in physical therapy where I'm like, that hurts, that can't be good. And they say, no, it's good. keep doing it. No water breaks quite yet. It's taken their vulnerability, their openness, and their patience with my own body for me to come to trust my own body again. And so Jesus exposes himself, offers his body to his disciples, and then opens their minds to understand the scriptures, moving them from the kind of terror that captivated their hearts and froze them in place to a space where they could listen and hear, even though they still had doubts, and even though they still didn't quite understand. And so I think we come to learn from this lesson and from Luther that we learn to trust in the embodied struggle, in the midst of that struggle, to be trustworthy with and for one another. It's not by chastising, it's not by pointing to budget reports or reading long lists of accomplishments, but simply by exposing ourselves in vulnerability and work together. Now, I want to offer some ideas in my remaining time about what it means for us as a church to start embodying this kind of trust. And I want to say that we actually trust for reasons, even though we don't often think of it that way. And we often come to trust people because of competence and commitment. We trust folks when we think they can actually do what they've said they're going to do. I've come to trust my knee and my body as it actually does the things my therapist and doctors say that it will. And we come to trust through commitment. If you have the skills, are you going to use them? If you have the capacities, we're going to do with them what you said you would. I need more than good intentions to trust you. One of my best examples for this is when we're waiting for somebody at the airport. Say you're flying into Columbus and your good buddy is going to pick you up and take you to the good old Churchwide assembly. And you think to yourself, is this friend of mine actually competent? Their car usually isn't working so well. In fact, the last time I saw it, it was on blocks in their driveway. And this friend thinks they know how to repair cars, but I know they don't know how to repair cars. So if this friend whose car is questionable and skills even more questionable is committed to picking me up from the airport, I might believe their commitment but lack their competence. Conversely, it might go the other direction. They might have a great car, but I know how forgetful they are, or how they say they'll do things that they won't actually do, or how they set lofty goals for themselves and don't follow through on them. All of these things undermine our ability to trust when we lack the competence and lack the commitment. In his own work in translation and in Reformation, Luther constantly struggled and strove to display his competence and commitment to others. He wanted to show how good he was with German, constantly refining the language and the words he used, saying, if you can find better, please do. Let's keep making revisions for hours and hours on end. And when pressed, he wants to explain the choices he made. Don't just take my word for it. Let me walk you through how we got where we are. Let me show that I'm committed to this work of earning your trust in the work that I've done. As he says at one point, I have constantly tried and translating to produce a pure and clear German, and it's often happened that for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks we have searched and inquired for a single word, and sometimes not found it even then. I would suggest we might need to go easier on ourselves during this assembly time. If it took Luther many weeks to find one right word to use, we might need more than a few hours of amendments to get the language perfect. And to garner trust and to earn trust, Luther shared this work with the community. Yes, he was a singular force to be reckoned with, but he reckoned and worked with others. And at the end, this is a part of what it means to be a part of the priesthood of all believers. It isn't just anti-clericalism, tear down the priests, burn the institution. The idea is that all of us have a responsibility and accountability to one another in the Spirit and in our life together. And so Luther has to work on the translation, but has to turn it over to others for their work, their eyes, their approval, and yes, he says, even their rejection. If you don't like it, do something new, do something different, and then trust the priesthood as I have, and turn it over to others for their work to carry on. Just as Jesus did with his disciples. In Luke 24, after he's moved them through fear to understanding, he moves them into being witnesses, sending them out to proclaim the things they have seen on paths unknown to futures unknowable. But in doing this, Jesus turns over responsibility, accountability, and witnesses what reciprocity really looks like. In this, we see that trust isn't something won in one moment. It isn't won in this instance when Jesus shows up in that room, but it's won and earned time and time again, day after day, as the disciples continue their work of witnessing, turning back to those scriptures that he opened, turning back to that life that he lived, and hoping that that Spirit turns up again. Now, the task before us as Lutherans today isn't easy. And there are good reasons for this. One of these good reasons, is that sometimes as the people of God, we expect too much trust from other people. Sometimes we speak and act with an expectation that others will, or maybe should, see our churches as places of welcome and of goodness. The world should trust us, right? We're Lutherans. We're good Lutherans. We have this good heritage of grace and faith, not fear and works. People should trust us. We set great goals, wanting to grow the church by 1 million new people. But what we often forget is that this appears like a threat to a lot of folks. Right? You want to grow the church by 1 million people? We don't need 1 million more of you. Part of the problem is the millions we already got. Right? We're all full up on Christians, thank you very much. And I want to make that sentiment something about other Christians. Well, yeah, of course, there's some problematic Christians over there at the other convention center in Cincinnati. But in Columbus, no, they're afraid of us because of the ways we've shown ourselves to be incompetent and not committed. The way we have set goals for ourselves and failed to meet them. The way we've had lofty conversations and aspirations only to show that we didn't have the energy or time or desire to put in the work. And sometimes we have done all those things and the work has still failed and people still don't know if they can trust us. At the same time, we often in the church demand that people trust us. Trust the institution. When I was in seminary at Chicago, they often told us to trust the process. I don't know about that. I trust some people. I trust many Lutherans, many bishops, but not always in the same way. Many people trust me. Some may not. Some of you don't know me from Adam. This is a more complicated thing, and it shows our lack of understanding about how trust works and how God works when we walk around demanding that it work for us. On the flip side, I would say that sometimes we have a bit too little trust. We can be consumed with a perpetual skepticism or cynicism that says nobody can be trusted. We always see and expect the worst. Even when the Senate Assembly passes the motion that I was pushing for, they sort of passed it pretty quickly, didn't they? Well, of course they said they would do it, but we'll see what happens. We know how they are. This leads us towards a path of despair and confidence that we know in advance how things will go. And this despair and cynicism is itself kind of trusting in ourselves. If we're assured of the outcomes in advance, if we think we know how things will go for better or worse, that gives us some sense that we can control things. But we can't. And so we are left, as Luther often pointed us to the need to question what we're trusting in and why, with no definitive or final answers. Always knowing we trust in God, but never quite knowing where God is showing up in ourselves or in our neighbors. So I'm going to close by saying that I've left us with a bit of a tension. Here we are between too much trust and too little, and how will we ever know where we fall between those two extremes? And I'm going to use an image to try and add some clarity. Hopefully you all recognize this person, Simone Biles. After years of dedication, learning to trust her body, she became and is a phenomenal Olympic, world-class athlete. Over the years, she had to place her trust in the people who have helped to coach her and prepare her along the way. And she had to learn that sometimes the people she trusted in wouldn't support her and wouldn't help her. And sometimes the body she's relied upon all those years actually wouldn't respond the way that she expected it to, as she stumbled and fell and even withdrew. Even after years of dedication and hard work, years of spinning through the air at incredible speed, she's had to learn that trust comes and goes. And as she's spinning and twirling, focusing her eyes on that balance beam, trying to land on that narrow strip so high above the ground, she's had to wonder, will her trust fail her this time or not? As Lutherans in our world today, trying to embody trust, we also are spinning in the air, trying to find that point where we can trust and be trustworthy. And so we keep our eyes focused when we know that the embodied word has been embodied in Christ. As the famous painting from Cranach reminds us, we keep our eyes focused on Christ. We do this best when we confess in our bodies that we are and are not connected to the Word. We point to Jesus but are not Jesus. We stand at a distance but know where we're pointing. We are mired in our own cycles of sin, complicity and complacency, ignorance and inaction. We confess that in our bodies we are brought close to that word by God's grace, and that despite our best efforts to separate ourselves from God, God remains committed to us in a relationship of pure trust. At times, siblings in Christ, it feels as if we're going to crash to the ground, spinning in the air time and time again, from one controversy to the next, from one apology to the next, from one mistake to the next. But we keep pointing in our hearts and our minds and our soul, focused on where they need to be. We are reeling, but we will land. We are broken but being made whole in these fragile bodies, these Christian bodies that fail us, in our knees that give out, in our bishops that disappoint, in our parishioners that let us down. We still know that in this fragility, God's Spirit can work to rebuild. And so, as best we can, limping along as Lutherans, we trust the God that has embodied us and try to embody that God as best we can. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your work.
Thank you. Wait, don't leave. No, we have a gift for you. Thank you. Thanks. Wonderful.